Hello everyone, I am Valerie Taylor and I'm going to talk a little bit about Belmont. But I'm framing Belmont in the context of African History Month. I want to say two things about African History Month. One, today we talk about the African aspects of our culture in a way that makes it sound very obvious, as if everybody understood and accepts that that is a fact. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is a very recent development. Not until the activities of the 1960s, and in particular in Trinidad, the work of Emergence with the Black Power Revolution, did we understand more completely what the connections were between people who look like me and Africa in fact were. This, of course, had to do with the fact that for hundreds of years, the existence of Africa, the excellence of Africa, the power of Africa was quite a phenomenon that was denied, and many people really and truly did not understand the connection. We spoke about being Creole, we spoke about being black, we might even have been speaking about being Negroes, but the cultural connection to Africa was something that was very misunderstood. I want then to draw your attention to four people before I start to talk about Belmont. I want to talk about the work that was done by Andrew Carr in documenting the Rada community in Belmont in the 1950s. I want to talk about the work done by Dr. J.D. Elder, who did fantastic work on African survivals in Trinidad and Tobago back in the 50s, 60s, down to the 70s. And of course, there's the work that Maureen Warner Lewis has done, very thorough work, particularly on the Yoruba, but including all of the other linguistic survivals and cultural survivals. I want to mention Elton Scantlebury. Elton was a tireless advocate for Belmont, an Orisha practitioner himself. He devoted a lot of his life, until he died just a couple of years ago, to making people understand not only the beauty of Belmont, but also the African-inspired elements of Belmont. Okay, so where is Belmont? Most Trinidadians would have heard about it, and they would have heard about it in relation to one of the African aspects of its cultural history. People would know about Belmont sometimes because, yes, of the Rada or of the Orisha. They would know about Belmont because of its connection to the complex of Carnival, the Calypso, the steel band, the mass. And all of those are aspects that make Belmont a really unique community that is absolutely culturally rich and with very deep African roots and traditions. Belmont is in the northern part of Port of Spain, and you would have the Savannah on the west, and then you have the Belmont Circular Road that runs from the Savannah and literally makes a circle around Belmont and comes back out again in the area of Charlotte Street between the hospital and, of course, Observatory Street. It's a community that is mixed. The history of Belmont really starts with the name Belmont, which was given because of a house that was on the hill that is in the area just around where the Hilton Hotel is now. It was a house owned by Edward Barry, and we can still see Barry's grave in Belmont Park, or Burt Allen Park as it's known. Barry would have sold the property or rented the property at any rate, yes, rented the property at the end of the 18th century, just about 1784. And that property came to be the Belmont House, Belmont being the French for beautiful mountain, that housed some of our governors from about 1808 onwards. So the name Belmont, from Belmont, the beautiful mountain, that is just to the north and overlooks Belmont. Belmont was, for a very long time, small parcels of cocoa, coffee, sugar and cotton plantations, mainly on the flatter areas. And then when we started to mount the hills, it would have looked then very much as it looks today. Very wooded, very full of large trees, mango trees and breadfruit trees. People who know Belmont know that in almost every yard you would find some large breadfruit or mango tree or guava tree. It was and continues to be a place where you can find a lot of greenery going up the hills, and that is in fact what Belmont is. But the main village of Belmont, what would have been called Belmont, would be in the area between Pelham Street, Earthick Road, Norfolk Street and the Belmont Circular Road. And mentioning Pelham Street, I just want to mention the fact that a lot of the lands that Belmont developed on once belonged to the Warner family, a very well-known English family. Charles Warner was an Attorney General. His sons, Pelham Warner was a famous cricketer, and the lands that they owned would have given us names like Cadiz Road, Pelham Street, Archer Street, remembering members of that family. There are also the lands called the lands belonging to the Black Warners, which would have been lands that had been gifted to a black British West India soldier, and Zamti, I think his name was, and his daughter would have married into Warners. So you had the white Warners and you had the brown to black Warners, and that accounts for a lot of the land that stretches from Earthick Road all the way up to Belmont Circular Road, and on the other side to places like St. Margaret's Church, because that land was actually a gift from the Warner family, and that's where the church is. So that's Belmont geographically. Culturally, one of the most important things to recognize about Belmont was that the very first settlers would have been the ex-slaves. Once the slavery had ended, 1834, 1838, we understood that the ex-slaves settled on the lands that would run from the savannah to what we now call Belmont Valley Road. And we have the name Freetown, or Freetown Valley, when you start to talk about the Valley Road itself. However, not only did ex-slaves settle there, probably just around the 1840s, but a very interesting phenomenon that most people don't quite remember is that we had liberated Africans. Liberated Africans were Africans who had been freed from slavers that were leaving the west coast of Africa by the English, because the English had stopped the slave trade, but the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese hadn't. And the English were determined to stop slave trading by capturing these slavers and freeing the enslaved. Most of the enslaved were taken back to Sierra Leone. But once we had the abolition of slavery, there was a lot of discussion about where we would get labor. And one of the ideas was to bring the freed Africans to Trinidad, to the Caribbean, where they could work and be paid rather than letting them go back to Africa. So between the 1840s and 1860s, we had over 9,000 liberated Africans being brought to Trinidad. Many of these, most of these, would have been Yoruba, and they would have been people related to the Yoruba, such as the Alada, but they would have also included a few, not as many as in earlier days, the Hausa, the Mandingo, the Igbo, and the Congo, who would have been here probably in larger numbers from earlier times. So when we talk about the settlement of Freetown in the mid-19th century, we are talking about the arrival of Africans direct from Africa who had not been enslaved and who brought with them their culture intact. This culture would have in fact revitalized and re-energized the African survivals that had suffered through the 200-300 years of slavery and colonialism. So, growing up in Belmont as I did, I would have known the word Shango as long as I've known myself as being a part of life. And of course, Shango was a god of was the chief god of the Orishas, and it was of course the one that was most worshipped in Belmont. So the sound of drums coming from Shango practitioners would have been a part of Belmont from its very earliest development. So when we look at what did the African influence mean for Belmont, we see, yes, we see religion, and of course, as I said, the large numbers of Yoruba who came as liberated Africans would have contributed to that. So we have Yorubas who lived in Bella Road, we had Yorubas who lived in the Lakuha area and around the area. There were, of course, the Radas that I mentioned that was so well documented by Andrew Carr. And it is because of that documentation going back to the 1950s that we could understand a lot more of how it was that these people came to Trinidad. The story of Zawinu and his descendants in Antoine Lane in Belmont is really a very important part of the history of Belmont. That speaks to us not only about religion and the ethos and the character, because a lot of the African religion had to do with character, how you lived and living well, and that would have found itself in some of the life ways of people in Belmont, some of the way they behaved in terms of, cordialities and community living and how you live with each other. A lot of that would have had an African basis. However, one of the most interesting developments in Belmont would have been around Carnival. And there is still a lot of discussion about where the Carnival came from. And I think most people accept that it has a lot to do with the celebrations, the pre-Lenten celebrations that were introduced mainly by the French. And of course we can find carnivals all over Europe today. However, what we do in Trinidad is without a doubt a development that has been very heavily influenced by an African sensibility. And that speaks not just to the issue of masking and masquerade, but of course the music that accompanied it. Africans are well known for their drums and their drumming. And any celebration would have included drumming, it would have included dancing, and it would have included chants of one sort or the other. Very important would be the 1884 banning of the skin drum following the Canbully riots of 1881. After 1881, the skin drum was outlawed, and we find that Africans continued to celebrate using the rhythmic patterns that would have been played out by the drum in a number of ways. There were attempts to use the shak-shaks, of course, and we all know about the tambour bamboo, which tambour, French for drum, the bamboo drum, was a replacement for the skin drums of the Africans. And those were the instruments that were prominent in our early carnivals. So when we start to look at the history of Carnival, we find that there is a very strong African influence. And in Belmont, we have examples of not just the practice of kalinda, which was an important part of the carnival and just general celebratory activities of Africans. We have the kalinda, which included drumming, which included singing, and of course, stick fighting. So, Crown Lion Yard in Belmont, the area around Hunter's Bar in Belmont, were well-known spots for stick fighting at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th centuries. And names like Joe Pringay and Big Tom and legends of stick fights, many of whom we just know their names and we still don't have enough information of them. So there's a lot of work to be done in really fleshing out the history of the African survivals, not only in Belmont, but in Trinidad and Tobago as a whole, so that we have a better understanding of how it formed the identity that sometimes we think is slipping away from us. A very important part of understanding ourselves will be understanding these cultural elements and how they were stitched together to create not just the Belmont that we know, the Port of Spain that we know, but the Trinidad and Tobago that we have today. So moving from the kalinda and the stick fights and the celebrations around Picket Corner and, as I said, Hunter's Bar, etc., which would have been very prominent in the Belmont of the early 20th century, we go to the development of the steel band just in the period between the wars, between the 1930s and the end of the war in 1945, with the emergence of the steel band. And the steel band, there are hundreds of stories of where it started. But the key point is that it was a definite descendant, not just of the tambo bamboo and the iron bands that had been part of it, bands where you had people making rhythms out of scrap iron, tins, etc. But you had the origin going all the way back to the skin drum of the Africans. And that's where J.E. Elder gives us one of the first explanations of the connection of the steel band, not as a brand new item, but as a development and innovation on African rhythms and drumming that has its origins way back in time. So steel band emerges in the East Dry River area in the late 1930s, and it develops in Belmont in an amazing way in the 1940s and 50s. So that Belmont would have been a place where in the 50s you would probably have found a steel band almost on every block. You have the legendary Rising Sun, you have Sunland, you have Dem Boys, Dem Fortunates, you had a host of Belmont bands, City Symphony, City Syncopators, a lot of bands. And then, of course, going all the way across the East Dry River, where there would have been the legendary ones like Desperados, etc. But in the 50s, Belmont was known as a center of carnival. The number of steel bands that came out of Belmont, their portrayals, particularly sailors, the portrayal of early sailor bands going back to Jim Harding, Diamond Jim Harding, the long-nosed sailor, those would have been Belmont bands of the 1930s. In the 50s, you would have had all the young people, Belmont fancy sailor bands and war sailor bands that were really absolutely phenomenal. And of course, on the other side, you had what we call the pretty mass. And Belmont, of course, is where Harold Saldina brought out his wonderful historical bands between the 1950s, I think as late as the 1970s. You had Wayne Barkley, who lived and worked in Belmont as well. And you generally had in Belmont an understanding of the importance of Carnival and a community involvement in Carnival that I think marks anybody who has ever lived in Belmont. Anybody who has lived in Belmont feels a special affinity to Carnival and a special appreciation of the elements of Carnival, and it includes not just the steel band, as I said, but the old stick fighters, the old drummers, and their understanding of the part that was played by the African descendants of the African survivals. Because of course, we've heard of the Yoruba bands of the 1940s, where the descendants of the Yorubas would have been participating in the way that they would have known, harking back to their own cultural practices in the street carnival of that time. So Belmont, a unique community, a community that has all the elements of African survivals with a huge respect, people accepting it and really forming part of your Belmont identity. There are many groups that are very far-flung. There's Belmont is We, that has a very strong presence where they talk to each other, many Belmont people who now live in other parts of the world, where they talk to each other about the Belmont history and the Belmont culture in a way that I hope at some point will be systematized, because there's a lot of work still to be done on getting the details of this history right and using it in developing a truer picture of our identity as Trinidadians and Togolese. So one of the fascinating aspects of Belmont is its architecture and the survival of quite a number of homes that have what we call the gingerbread style house. My house is one of the best examples that we have in Belmont of a gingerbread house, probably built somewhere in the early years of the 20th century, a family home, large backyard as all Belmont houses had, but absolutely beautiful in the work, the craftsmanship and the woodwork that is represented in this, the fretwork, the finials, and the other architectural elements that so many people associate with Belmont. Let's look at my house. Now, once Belmont had been settled from the 1860s and the 1870s, we begin to see a number of these beautiful houses emerging, particularly on the Belmont Circular Road. So you'll find them almost one next to each other, and they are all versions of what would have been an architectural style that was developed by George Brown. So sometimes you hear about the George Brown houses, and there are some very distinctive identifiers of these gingerbread or George Brown houses. Most of them would have been built between about 1895 and the early part of the 20th century, getting down into the first decade of the 20th century. Now, what makes it a gingerbread house? What makes it identified as one of George Brown's tropical design homes? You will look and see, of course, the steep gables. They're usually steep, and there are dormer windows which stand out from the roof. You look for elements such as the jalousies which are slatted wood, which allows for the free flow of air, and of course, on the roofs, the iconic finials, those wooden embellishments that are vertical, and which some say have something to do with preventing the witches and devils and other unsavory characters from landing on your house. Those are the finials. Of course, we look for other elements, and one of the most important is the fretwork. And this house has some of the most beautiful fretwork that we will find anywhere. It's wooden work that has been carved, some of it by hand, some of it by early machinery. And I have heard that there has been examples of African iconic designs in some of the fretwork as well. But of course, a lot of it would have been done by craftsmen who lived in and around places like Belmont. And as we said, coming with the liberated Africans, those who had worked before as tradesmen, a lot of our African descended peoples in this part of Trinidad would have been absolutely marvelous craftsmen, and a lot of the work that we are looking at here is due to their craftsmanship. So the Gingerbread House and Myla House, which is now in private hands and is available for rental as a conference center, is one of the most beautiful examples that has been restored and is in wonderful condition.